The next topic that I want to talk about is blog performance. And so here we're first going to talk about how script loading and parsing is going to affect a site performance. Any script or style sheet that you load from a plugin is going to be added to the page content and is going to increase the download time for that page and the render time. Now, depending on the nature of a plugin, it might actually not need to be loaded on all the pages of a blog. And so what I mean here specifically is if a plugin is trying to load scripts or style sheets, they might not need to be loaded on every single page of a site if your plugin is shortcode based and only renders contents on specific pages. So if you're inside of that situation and you want to only have your content show up on specific places, what you can use is a filter on the posts. So the post is something that's executed very early on inside of the WordPress loop. And so what it's going to let you do is go in there and parse the content of the posts, and then afterwards do things like queue up a style or queue up a script based on whether or not you find a specific content. So if you're using shortcodes, these shortcodes will actually be available to you when the posts are being parsed out. They haven't been expanded yet to their full content. Now here we're using, if we actually see that there's a need to render that plugin content, then we're going to use that magical function that we talked about earlier called WP-enqueue script or style to be able to get that loaded up in the queue and output when the page header is rendered on the screen. The next thing to talk about concerning performance is to be careful with the database access that you do inside of your plugin. Now, inside of most plugins that have an admin page, you're going to have options. These options will be stored inside of the option table inside of your WordPress database. There are two utility functions that you can use to be able to retrieve data from that database and write data to it, and these are get option and update option. Now, that being said, some people use these not in the most efficient way. They're going to call get option and have a single name for every single option that they're going to have in their plugin. What that means is that at runtime, every time you make these calls to get options, you're going to be hitting the database, requesting information, and then passing on that information and deciding what to do based on how that particular option is set. A better way to do things is to use arrays. So get option and update option can work with single variables, or they can be used to store arrays. So in the sample code that we're seeing here, I'm retrieving an option called link library settings, and so that gets passed over to a variable, and afterwards I can just access the different members of that array, the different elements, and be able to see what data is inside of them. So with a single get option call, I can retrieve all options for my plugin and then just work through these over time. So that's one quick database query. I get my data and I can just keep going. Now, there's actually a second benefit to doing this other than performance, and that is scalability. So in the case of my plugin, Link Library, I wanted to be able to create multiple configurations so that you could have multiple different pages that would have on them link lists, and so these could be configured differently in terms of how you want them laid out or what link categories you want to see displayed. So in this case, having everything stored as an array just made it very easy to build a variable name including the ID of the setting set, and afterwards just retrieving that one element, and the rest of the code doesn't even really know that there's multiple configurations available. It just gets a set of options and it executes. The next topic under performance is to try to find ways to reduce page refreshes and how big your database queries are, or how much data they're going to return. So the first thing I must say here is that users are really good at finding ways to store a large amount of data in your database. So if you have a plugin that's data driven, they're going to fill it up really quickly. For example, I had a user that had more than 6,000 links inside of Link Library. He was actually using it for basically an anime torrent site, and so he would have all of these different links inside of this database. Another example is for Tune Library, so my iTunes-based plugin. I had a user with over 50,000 songs, so he quickly complained that things were not loading very fast since it had to query all this data and then render a page with all this information. Something else to be mentioned is that you have users that have a lot of content on their page. So they're going to have the output of your plugin somewhere on their website, but around that plugin, they're going to have a sidebar with things like a photo gallery or a fancy flash thing or a video or whatever it may be. They're going to have a lot of heavy content on their website. So refreshing a page over and over is going to be difficult for them if you have a content heavy plugin, because it might need to refresh the whole page. So there's two things you can do here to alleviate these two different issues. The first one is to only try to show a subset of the data when you first display the content of the plugin. So for example, in Tune Library, I've added options so that you can only show one letter at a time. So artists whose names start with that letter. So this way you only get a subset of your data that comes up, and afterwards you can choose other letters and be able to see this, what else is available inside of the data for that plugin. Now that being said, while this can work pretty nicely, you still have the issue of the page refresh. If you're using a basic HTML get method, when you click on a link, it's going to send a few parameters and then reload a whole page based on what the user selected. You still have the issue that the sidebar has to all reload and all these different other plugins have to load. So that's where you want to turn to something like Ajax. By using Ajax, you can actually only refresh that part of the page that your plugin is rendering with a new set of data. So going back to Tune Library, when I click a new artist letter, I can only refresh the list of artists and their associated albums and tracks and not have to refresh the whole website. Now there's libraries like jQuery that make it very easy to do Ajax queries to be able to retrieve that data and then render it back on the site.